Hi guys, this is Mrs. Mendy. Okay, so last time when we were talking about genetics, we asked what happens if you cross purebred purple pea flowers with purebred white pea flowers and guess what the offspring will look like. Well, let me review a little bit for a second. Remember that purebred means that they always have offspring with the same trait. That means in this case that they're the same color when they're crossed with the same breed. So that means whenever you cross a purebred purple flower with another purebred purple flower, you get all purple flowers. And similarly, if you cross a purebred white flower with a purebred white flower, you get all white flowers. And this is for pea flowers because different plants are different. Purebred also means homozygous, which we practiced already, knowing the difference between homozygous and heterozygous. So purebred means homozygous, or that the two alleles, and the two alleles are one from each parent, are the same. And remember, allele means like a type of a gene. So kind of like the flavor or the recipe that that gene has. Okay, so you can see that the all of these are homozygous. They have the same alleles. These ones, the purple ones have the big P, and the white ones have the little p, and they're homozygous, meaning these two are the same. So what happens when we cross this? Purebred purple flower and a purebred white flower. Think for a second about what you expect to see. Do you expect to see like an intermediate color between these? Do you expect to see like stripes of equal amounts of white and purple? Or what happens? So here's what happens. If you cross white pea flowers with purple pea flowers, you get all purple flowers, not any that are white. So why no white flowers? And what happens is because the big P allele overpowers the little p allele. Remember, the allele is like the flavor of the gene, which type or recipe it is. So if you cross big P with little p, every one of the babies is going to get one allele from this parent and one allele from this parent. Okay, so it had to get a big P from one and a little p from the other because that's all they're purebred. That's all that they have to give. Okay, so every one of the offspring, the babies, are big P, little p. So they're heterozygous. They're big P, little p. And so if the big P and the little p are in combination, then the big P overpowers it because the big P, remember, is for purple. And so then they all are purple. It's like the little p isn't even there. It just gets completely overpowered. Okay, so purple pea flowers can have one or two purple alleles. You can't tell what genes it has or what alleles it has just by looking at it because it's purple. Okay, so it can be big P, or it can be big P, little p. They look exactly the same. Okay, but white pea flowers all have two white alleles, so they're little p, for sure, because that's the only way. If there's a big P mixed in there, it gets overpowered. The white ones get overpowered and they become purple. Okay, so little p only is white. Okay, so we have names for which one is powerful and which one is not. So the dominant allele, and that's a vocabulary word you should absolutely write down and know forever and ever after this. The dominant allele is big P. So the dominant allele is defined as the one that shows when it's in a heterozygous combination. So if it's big P, little p, the dominant one is the one that shows up. And that is why we call it big P. That's why it gets to be capitalized, is because it's the dominant one. Okay, we call recessive allele the little p. The little p is the one that hides when it's heterozygous. It gets covered up. It does not show. Okay, so that's the little p, that's the allele for white flower, but it gets totally covered up when it's heterozygous like this. Okay, so that's new words you have to know. You already have to know homozygous, heterozygous, and now you need to know dominant and recessive also. There will be more vocabulary coming, so make sure you write it down so you can study it later. Okay, this is just kind of showing it again. The dominant allele is the one that shows when there are two different alleles. And the recessive allele is the one that's hidden when there are two different alleles. So if you're purple, you can be big P, big P. If you're purple, you could happen to be big P, little p. But if you're white, it's going to be little p, your flower. Okay, check and see that you got that last concept of dominant and recessive. Okay, if a purebred black mouse is crossed with a purebred white mouse, they have all black babies. And this is true, I looked it up. They have all black babies. So, is the black fur allele, dominant or recessive? Is it dominant or recessive if this cross between these two mice, purebred mice, if all the babies are black, is black fur allele, is that dominant or recessive? And it's dominant. Black fur allele is dominant. You could tell because the babies that are crossed are all that color. Okay. Excuse me. All right, new vocabulary word, genotype. Genotype is the combination of genes or alleles at a gene in an organism. And we've been using genotypes, but we haven't called it that word. So this two-letter combination that can be homozygous or heterozygous, that's called the genotype. Genotype. Okay, so it's this two-letter combination, one letter for each allele. Each parent gives one allele, one letter to the baby. Okay, so the genotype is the letters, it's the genes. Okay, so there are different kinds of genotypes depending on what it looks like. Okay, so because now you know about dominant and recessive, this makes things, we can name something else about the genotype, the two-letter combination. Okay, so say that we're talking about some gene where big A is the dominant allele and little a is the recessive allele. Okay, so then big A, and big A, little a will have the dominant phenotype. They will look, oh, and I didn't define phenotype yet. That'll come. Okay, so phenotype means what it looks like. Okay, so what it looks like, not what the gene is, but what it looks like. Okay, so before, and when it was purple color that we were talking about, like big P, and big P, little p, this is true for anything. If it's two big letters, or if it's one big letter and one little letter, they will have the dominant phenotype. Okay, if it's little a, they will have the recessive phenotype. A phenotype means what it looks like. What it looks like. Okay, so here are some other names for you to know. So remember you had homozygous and heterozygous before, right? And this was homozygous and this was homozygous. This one was heterozygous because it was different, two different ones. But now that we know what this is going to look like, we call this, to tell the difference between big A, and little a, because they're both homozygous, we call big A homozygous dominant because it has two of the dominant allele. And we can tell it's dominant because it's a capital letter. That's how we show that it's dominant. Okay? If it's got two of the little letter, two of the recessive allele, the one that hides when it's heterozygous. So homozygous recessive is little a. It's two of the recessive allele. Okay? Homozygous recessive, two of the little one. homozygous dominant, two of the big dominant allele. Heterozygous is the same. We don't add another thing on there. Okay. But know that whatever is the dominant allele, whatever that looks like, these two are going to look like the dominant allele. Big A, big A. If there's any big A at all, the big A overpowers the little a. Okay, so, and I should have put these before. Genotype, well, we did that. That's the combination of alleles you get from your parents, right? And you can compare that to phenotype. Phenotype is the trait you can see. Okay, so if the genotype is like the DNA, the genotype codes for the phenotype. Okay, phenotype is what it looks like. I'll go back because this is kind of weird here. You can see that the trait that they're talking about here is tongue rolling. You may remember the other day when we were doing human traits in class, we looked at tongue rolling as a thing, and that's kind of fun. So, this whole family here, they're all rolling their tongues to see if they can do it or not. Okay, so you can see that this, I don't know why they put that as big D R. Imagine it's like big D, little d. So the mother has one gene for tongue rolling and one gene not for tongue rolling. I think they did that to be dominant recessive to help you see that. Uh, so both the father and the mother. So depending on which gene you got from the parents, because you could get either one, right? So this daughter, she got the big D gene from or allele from her mother and from her father, so she can roll her tongue. Her genotype is big D, big D. This boy, he got big D R, so that would be like big D, little d. So, but he's still got AD, so he can, or one copy of the D, so he can still roll his tongue. This girl, she got the same. She got at least one big D from her parents. But this kid here, he happened to get the recessive gene from his parents. Okay, so then he cannot roll his tongue. Okay, because if the dominant is tongue rolling. Okay, phenotype, trait you can see. All right, here's another example of phenotype. So if the phenotype is blue eyes, then the genotype, so the phenotype is what it looks like. Genotype is what the alleles are, what the genes are. The genotype is what the genes are. That's why it's geno. Okay? And if it's little b, and then recessive is B. Did I spell recessive wrong? I probably did. It's probably another C. Hmm. Mm. Terrible. Okay. Anyway, or maybe not. Maybe it's just because it has this equals. Okay, so the recessive allele is little b. Okay, so if this genotype is little b, and the phenotype is blue eyes. Okay, the phenotype for brown eyes. So phenotype is what it looks like. So that's brown eyes, and then the genotype we can't really tell because big B is dominant. So big B for brown eyes, that's dominant. And so that could either be big B, little b, or big B, big B. We can't really tell. We can't tell just by looking at the phenotype, what it looks like. Okay? Unless you know what the parents are, then you can kind of figure it out. Okay? So, like, for example, I know my dad was Asian, and so he had brown eyes, and his parents and his parents and his parents before. So I'm pretty sure that he would be um, homozygous dominant for eye color because he would be big B, big B. My mother has blue eyes, so she would be little b, little b. Okay, so then that means that if they did a cross, which they did because I'm born, um, I have one big B gene and one big B allele and one little b allele. So I would look like this. I have brown eyes, but I'd be big B, little b. Okay? Genotype, phenotype. Write it down, know it forever. Okay, these flowers are pink. Is pink their genotype or their phenotype? Because that's a kind of thing, that's a distinction I'm going to expect you to know. Okay? Did you say phenotype? Well, it is phenotype. The thing that you look at is phenotype. That's it for today. I will see you next time.